Chapter 4. How to Make a Cultural Species. To understand why European explorers couldn't survive as hunter-gatherers, while locals, even when stranded alone, could, we need to understand how populations generate cultural adaptations, the suites or packages of skills, beliefs, practices, motivations, and organizational forms that permit people to survive, and often thrive, in diverse and challenging environments. The process is, in some crucial sense, smarter than we are. Over generations, often outside of conscious awareness, individuals' choices, learned preferences, lucky mistakes, and occasional insights aggregate to produce cultural adaptations. These often complex packages contain subtle and implicit insights that impress modern engineers and scientists. Reference Chapter 7. We have glimpsed some of these cultural adaptations, from Inuit clothing to Nardu detoxification, and will study other such adaptations, ranging from food taboos that protect pregnant women from marine toxins to religious rituals that galvanize greater prosociality. Before getting to these, however, we need to build an understanding of cultural evolution from the ground up that can explain how it is that human populations end up with complexes of tools, tastes, and techniques that are honed to local environmental challenges. This brings us to a central insight. Rather than opposing cultural with evolutionary or biological explanations, researchers have now developed a rich body of work showing how natural selection, acting on genes, has shaped our psychology in a manner that generates non-genetic evolutionary processes capable of producing complex cultural adaptations. Culture and cultural evolution are then a consequence of genetically evolved psychological adaptations for learning from other people. That is, natural selection favored genes for building brains with abilities to learn from others. These learning abilities, when operating in populations and over time, can give rise to subtly adaptive behavioral repertoires, including those related to fancy tools and large bodies of knowledge about plants and animals. These emergent products arose initially as unintended consequences of the interaction of learning minds in populations over time. With this intellectual move, cultural explanations become but one type of evolutionary explanation among a potential host of other non-cultural explanations. In their now classic treatise, Culture and the Evolutionary Process, Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson laid the foundations of this approach by developing a body of mathematical models that explore our capacities for cultural learning as genetically evolved psychological adaptations. Once cultural learning is approached as a psychological adaptation, or as a suite of adaptations, we can then ask how natural selection has shaped our psychology and motivations so as to allow us to most effectively acquire useful practices, beliefs, ideas, and preferences from others. These are questions about who we should learn from and what we should attend to and infer, as well as when input from cultural learning should overrule our own direct experience or instincts. Evidence from diverse scientific fields is now revealing how finely tuned our psychological adaptations for cultural learning are. Natural selection has equipped our species with a wide range of mental abilities that allow us to effectively and efficiently acquire information from the minds and behaviors of other people. These learning instincts emerge early in infants and young children and generally operate unconsciously and automatically. In many circumstances, as we discussed in the matching pennies game and rock, paper, scissors, we find it difficult to inhibit our automatic imitative instincts. As we'll discuss, even when getting right answers is important, our cultural learning mechanisms fire up to influence our practices, strategies, beliefs, and motivations. In fact, sometimes the more important getting the right answer is, the more we rely on cultural learning. As a point of departure, it is worth considering how pervasive the effects of cultural learning are on our behavior and psychology. Coming up, a list will show just some of the domains where the influence of cultural learning has been studied. The list includes domains of distinct evolutionary importance, such as food preference, mate choice, technological adoptions, and suicide, as well as social motivations related to altruism and fairness. As we'll discuss in later chapters, cultural learning reaches directly into our brains and changes the neurological values we place on things and people, and in doing so, it also sets the standards by which we judge ourselves. One classic set of experiments shows that children acquire the performance standards by which they are willing or unwilling to reward themselves. Children saw a demonstrator rewarding himself or herself with M&Ms only after exceeding either a relatively high score in a bowling game or a relatively low score. The children copied the rewarding standards of the demonstrator, such that the kids exposed to the high standards model tended not to eat the M&Ms unless their score exceeded the higher threshold. As will become clear, culturally acquired standards or values guide our efforts and persistence at individual learning, training, and trial and error learning. A list of domains of cultural learning: food preferences and quantity eaten, mate choices, individual and their traits, economic strategies, investments, artifact, tool, functions and use, suicide, decision and method, technological adoptions, word meanings and dialect, categories, dangerous animals, beliefs, for example, about gods, germs, etc., social norms, taboos, rituals, tipping, standards of reward and punishment, social motivations, altruism and fairness, self-regulation, judgment heuristics. Let's begin by exploring how thinking of our cultural learning abilities as genetically evolved psychological adaptations deepens our understanding of both how we adapt to our worlds as individuals and how populations adapt to their environments over generations. Our first question is, how should individuals figure out whom to learn from? This question is crucial because it will illuminate how cultural adaptations can emerge. Suppose you are a boy living in a hunter-gatherer band. To survive, the men in your community hunt a wide range of game. How should you go about hunting? You could just start experimenting. Maybe try throwing rocks at gazelles or chasing some zebras. Or you could wait for some evolved instincts for hunting to fire up and tell you what to do. If you go this route, you'll probably wait a long time, as this is the situation that Franklin, Burke, and Narvaez found themselves in. Franklin's men lived for 18 months on the pack ice with starvation looming, but no one figured out how to harpoon a seal. In fact, since you are a member of a cultural species, your instincts will fire up, but instead of supplying specialized hunting abilities, they will cause you to start looking for people to copy. But not just any people. Aspiring young hunters first glean as much as they can from those to whom they have ready access, like their brothers, fathers, and uncles. Later, perhaps during adolescence, Learners update and improve their earlier efforts by focusing on and learning from the older, most successful, and most prestigious hunters in their community. That is, learners should use 3 cultural learning cues to target their learning: age, success, and prestige. You might also use being male as a cue, since, let's assume, hunting is predominantly a male activity. These cues will not only help you zoom in on those in your community most likely to possess adaptive practices, routines, beliefs, and skills related to hunting, but will also allow you to gradually scaffold up your abilities and know-how while making the most of what those who care about you know. Moreover, since particular individuals may be successful or prestigious for idiosyncratic reasons, like possessing good genes, you'll want to sample several of the top hunters and use only those practices preferred by a plurality of them. More broadly, evolutionary reasoning suggests that learners should use a wide range of cues to figure out whom to selectively pay attention to and learn from. Such cues allow them to target those people most likely to possess information that will increase the learner's survival and reproduction. In weighting the importance of those they can potentially learn from, hereafter their models, individuals should combine cues related to the model's health, happiness, skill, reliability, competence, success, age, and prestige, as well as correlated cues like displays of confidence or pride. These cues should be integrated with others related to self-similarity, such as sex, temperament, or ethnicity, cued by, for example, language, dialect, or dress. Self-similarity cues help learners focus on those likely to possess cultural traits, for example, practices or preferences, that will be useful to the learner in their future roles. Same-sex cues, for example, reduce the time spent by teenage boys attending to the details of many female-specific activities, such as those associated with nursing. For example, how to latch an infant, or what to do when a viscous yellowish secretion, colostrum, first emerges from the nipple after birth. Together, all of these cues provide input to model-based cultural learning mechanisms because they help individuals figure out from whom to learn. Let's take a closer look at our selective cultural learning. Skill and success. Since many model-based cues, such as success and prestige, are only loosely tied to particular domains of behavior, such as hunting or golf, we expect them to influence learning about a broad spectrum of cultural traits, ranging from preferences for food, mates, wine, and linguistic labels, to beliefs about invisible agents or forces like gods, germs, angels, karma, and gravity. This is not to say that we should expect the same cues to have the same size impact on very different domains. What makes someone a successful hunter or basketball player is surely better predicted by their arrow-making techniques or their jump shot form, respectively, but may also be impacted by the practice of eating carrots or by saying a brief prayer before heading out to hunt or play basketball. Eating carrots might improve a shooter's vision, while a prayer ritual might calm and focus the mind, or possibly bring supernatural aid. Let's begin by looking more deeply at the impact of cues related to skill and success, which capture notions of competence and reliability. Skill cues are those that relate most directly to competence in a domain. For example, one might assess a writer's skill by reading his books. In a foraging society, an aspiring hunter might watch an older hunter adeptly stalk a giraffe, crouch in a tree's shadow, and fluidly release an accurately targeted arrow. By contrast, success cues are more indirect, but potentially more useful, because they aggregate information. Using success cues, you might evaluate a writer on the number of copies that his book sells, and a hunter by the frequency with which he brings home big game. Since many hunting societies have practices that facilitate easy accounting of prior kills, you might be able to look at how many monkey teeth a hunter has on his necklace, or at the number of pig mandibles hung outside of his house. To see the power and pervasiveness of the use of success cues in cultural learning, consider the following experiment. MBA students participated in 2 different versions of an investment game. In the game, they had to allocate their money across 3 different investment options labeled A, B, and C. They were told each investment's average monetary returns and its variation. Sometimes you get more than average, other times less. They were also told the relationships or correlations among the investments. For example, if investment A's value goes up, then B's value tends to go down. Participants could borrow money to invest. During each round of the game, each player would make his or her allocations and receive the returns. After each round, players could alter their investment allocations for the next round, and this went on for 16 rounds. At the end of the game, each player's portfolio performance ranking relative to the other players heavily influenced their grade in the course, moving it up or down. If you know any MBAs, you'll know this is a serious incentive, and these players were thus strongly motivated to make the most money in the game. The experimenters randomly assigned players to one of 2 different versions, or treatments. In one version, the MBAs made their decisions in isolation, receiving only the individual experience derived from their own choices over the 16 rounds. The other version was identical, except that the allocations chosen and performance rankings of all participants were posted between each round, using anonymous labels. The difference in the results from each version surprised the economists who designed the experiment, though admittedly many economists are pretty easily surprised by human behavior. 3 patterns are striking. First, the MBAs didn't use the additional information available in the second treatment, with posted performances, in the complex and sophisticated way economic theory assumes. Instead, careful analysis shows that many participants were merely copying, mimicking, the investment allocations made by the top performers in the previous round. Second, the environment of this experiment is simple enough that one can actually calculate the profit-maximizing investment allocations. This optimal allocation can be compared with where participants actually ended up in round 16 for each of the 2 versions. Left only to their own individual experience, the MBAs ended up very far away from the optimal allocation, thus poor overall performance. However, in the second treatment, when they mimicked each other's investments, the group zeroed in on the optimal allocation by the end of the game. Here, the whole group made more money, which is interesting since there were no incentives for group performance, as grade assignments were all based on relative rankings. Finally, while opportunities to imitate each other had a dramatic effect on improving the overall group performance, it also led to some individual catastrophes. Sometimes top performers had taken large risks, which paid off in the short run. They got lucky. But their risky allocations, which often included massive borrowing, were copied by others. Since you can't copy the luck along with the allocation choices, an inflated number of bankruptcies resulted as a side effect. The central finding of this experiment, that people are inclined to copy more successful others, has been repeatedly observed in an immense variety of domains, both in controlled laboratory conditions and in real-world patterns. In experiments, undergraduates rely on success bias learning when real money is on the line, when they are paid for correct answers or superior performance. In fact, the more challenging the problem, or the greater the uncertainty, the more inclined people are to rely on cultural learning, as predicted by evolutionary models. This tells us something about when individuals will rely on cultural learning over their own direct experience or intuitions. Interestingly, if you are a real stock market investor, this is now a formal strategy. You can purchase exchange-traded funds, ETFs, that match the picks of the market gurus, Guru, billionaire investors, iBillionaire, or the top money managers, Alpha. But remember, you can't copy their luck. Experimentally, economists have also shown that people rely on this skill or success-biased cultural learning to 1. Infer and copy others' beliefs about the state of the world, even when others have identical information, and 2. Adapt to competitive situations, where copying others is far from the optimal strategy. In the real world, farmers from around the globe adopt new technologies, practices, and crops from their more successful neighbors. Running in parallel with the work in economics, decades of work by psychologists have also shown the importance of success and skill biases. This work underlines the point that these learning mechanisms operate outside conscious awareness and with or without incentives for correct answers. One set of recent experiments by Alex Massoudi and his collaborators are particularly relevant for our focus here on complex technologies. In his arrowhead design task, participants engaged in repeated rounds of trial and error learning using different arrowhead designs to engage in virtual hunting on a computer. Whenever the opportunities were made available, students readily used success-biased cultural learning to help design their arrowheads. When cultural information was available, it rapidly led the group to the optimal arrowhead design and was most effective in more complex, more realistic environments. In the last 15 years, an important complementary line of evidence has become available as developmental psychologists have returned to focusing on cultural learning in children and infants. With new evolutionary thinking in the air, they have zoomed in on testing specific ideas about the who, when, and what of cultural learning. It's now clear that infants and young children use cues of competence and reliability, along with familiarity, to figure out from whom to learn. In fact, by age 1, infants use their own early cultural knowledge to figure out who tends to know things, and then use this performance information to focus their learning, attention, and memory. Infants are well known to engage in what developmental psychologists call social referencing. When an infant or young child encounters something novel, say when crawling up to a chainsaw, they will often look at their mom or some other adult in the room to check for an emotional reaction. If the attending adult shows positive affect, they often proceed to investigate the novel object. If the adult shows fear or concern, they back off. This occurs even if the attending adult is a stranger. In one experiment, mothers brought 1-year-olds to the laboratory at Seoul National University. The infants were allowed to play and get comfortable in the new environment while mom received training for her role in the experiment. The researchers had selected 3 categories of toys, those to which infants typically react: 1, positively; 2, negatively; and 3, with uncertain curiosity, an ambiguous toy. These different kinds of toys were each placed in front of the infants, one at a time, and the infants' reactions were recorded. Mom and a female stranger sat on either side of the baby and were instructed to react either with smiling and excitement or with fear. The results of this study are strikingly parallel to studies of cultural learning among both young children and university students. First, the babies engaged in social referencing, looking at one of the adults 4 times more often and more quickly when an ambiguous toy was placed in front of them. That is, under uncertainty, they used cultural learning. This is precisely what an evolutionary approach predicts for when individuals should use cultural learning. Second, when faced with an ambiguous toy, babies altered their behavior based on the adult's emotional reactions. When they saw fear, they backed off. But when they saw happiness, they approached the toy and changed to regard it more positively. Third, infants tended to reference the stranger more than their moms, probably because Mom herself was new to this environment and was thus judged less competent by her baby. By 14 months, infants are already well beyond social referencing and already showing signs of using skill or competence cues to select models. After observing an adult model acting confused by shoes, placing them on his hands, German infants tended not to copy his unusual way of turning on a novel lighting device, using his head. However, if the model acted competently, confidently putting shoes on his feet, babies tended to copy the model and used their heads to activate the novel lighting device. Later, by age 3, a substantial amount of work shows that children not only track and use competence in their immediate cultural learning, but retain this information to selectively target their future learning in multiple domains. For example, young children will note who knows the correct linguistic labels for common objects, like ducks, use this information for targeting their learning about novel tools or words, and then remember this competence information for a week, using it to preferentially learn new things from the previously more competent model. Prestige. By watching whom others watch, listen to, defer to, hang around, and imitate, learners can more effectively figure out from whom to learn. Using these prestige cues allows learners to take advantage of the fact that other people also are seeking and have obtained insights about who in the local community is likely to possess useful, adaptive information. Once people have identified a person as worthy of learning from, perhaps because they've learned about their success, they necessarily need to be around them, watching, listening, and eliciting information through interaction. Since they are trying to obtain information, learners defer to their chosen models in conversation, often giving them the floor. And, of course, learners automatically and unconsciously imitate their chosen models, including by matching their speech patterns. Reference Chapter 8. Thus, we humans are sensitive to a set of ethological patterns, bodily postures or displays, including visual attention, holding the floor, deference in conversation, and vocal mimicry, as well as others. We use these prestige cues to help us rapidly zero in on whom to learn from. In essence, prestige cues represent a kind of second-order cultural learning in which we figure out who to learn from by inferring from the behavior of others who they think are worthy of learning from. That is, we culturally learn from whom to learn. Despite the seeming ubiquity of this phenomenon in the real world, there is actually relatively little direct experimental evidence that people use prestige cues. There is an immense amount of indirect evidence that shows how the prestige of a person or source, such as a newspaper or celebrity, increases the persuasiveness of what they say or the tendency of people to remember what they say. This effect occurs even when the prestige of a person comes from a domain, like golf, that is far removed from the issue they are commenting on, like automobile quality. This provides some evidence, though it does not get at the specific cues that learners might actually use to guide them, aside from being told that someone is an expert or the best. To address this in our laboratory, Maciej Czudek, Sue Birch, and I tested this prestige idea more directly. Sue is a developmental psychologist, and Maciej was my graduate student. He did all the real work. We had preschoolers watch a video in which they saw two different potential models use the same object in one of two different ways. In the video, two bystanders entered, looked at both models, and then preferentially watched one of them. The visual attention of the bystanders provided a prestige cue that seemingly marked one of the two potential models. Then participants saw each model select one of two different types of unfamiliar foods and one of two differently colored beverages. They also saw each model use a toy in one of two distinct ways. After the video, the kids were permitted to select one of two novel foods and one of the two colorful beverages. They could also use the toy any way they wanted. Children were 13 times more likely to use the toy in the same manner as the prestige-cued model compared to the other model. They were also about 4 times more likely to select the food or beverage preferred by the prestige-cued model. Based on questions asked at the end of the experiment, the children had no conscious or expressible awareness of the prestige cues or their effects. These experiments show that young children rapidly and unconsciously tune into the visual attention of others and use it to direct their cultural learning. We are prestige biased, as well as being skill and success biased. Chapter 8 expands on these ideas to explore how selective cultural learning drove the evolution of a second form of social status in humans called prestige, which in our species resides alongside dominance status, which we inherited from our primate ancestors. We'll explore why, for example, it is possible to become famous for being famous in the modern world.